If you're a lower security inmate, you have a lot of freedom of movement. You can basically move around wherever you want in your dormitory, an enclosed space, and there's no oversight about what you do with your time. Higher security inmates, guys in the SHU, that's the segregated housing unit, or guys who live in level 4 yards, basically people who the administration have decided are security risks, they live in cells. If you live in a cell, you might be in there for weeks or even months at a time. So you develop a really close relationship with your cellie. This is a man that you eat every meal with. In the summer you cook together, in the winter you freeze. If he gets bad news, it breaks your heart because you're there with him whenever he gets it. You watch the same things on TV, you talk about the same stuff every single day. My first couple of cellies that I had, I never really bonded with like this. My first two were at San Quentin, but because I was only there for about a month, I didn't have time to establish a close relationship with these guys. My next cellie I met whenever I was at High Desert. His name was Blanky, but he and I never really saw eye to eye. I won't go so far as to say we disliked each other, but he arranged to have me moved out after about a month of being there, and I didn't mind. And then I moved in with Scooby. I've talked about Scooby before. He and I were very close. He was more like an older brother than anything else. It's possible that if he hadn't been the person I moved in with, I might not have survived the first couple of years of my term. He showed me how to do time. Every time he comes up, I mention his addiction problem. I've been feeling a little guilty about that because it creates a one-sided picture of Scooby, as if his relationship with me was unfair. I helped him get apples or lent him money and he did his drugs and he didn't do anything for me in turn. We were very close. We were good friends. I wanted to tell a story about the kind of guy Scooby was that had nothing to do with his addiction, to demonstrate why I liked him, why he was such a decent guy. You see, whenever I first moved in with him, I was what's called Close A custody. Close A inmates have a lot less freedom of movement than other inmates. They're at a higher security level. Essentially, they count every inmate in the state of California a couple of times every day. Everybody has to be in their cell, and the cops count all the inmates to make sure nobody has escaped. They do this at 5 p.m., midnight, 3 a.m., and 5 a.m. However, Close A inmates are counted an additional 2 times every day because they're considered to be a greater risk for escape or violence. They're counted at noon and at 8 p.m. As a result, I had to spend a lot of more time in my cell than the other inmates because the cops needed to be able to count me specifically, and then I had to stay there for a little while they made sure that the numbers across the state added up. One day, Scooby came into the cell about 11:30 p.m. to have his lunch. This was very usual. Generally, the yard opened at 9 a.m. and stayed open until 11:30 a.m. At this time, people would come into their cells and the yard would get shut down so the cops could have a half hour to eat their lunch to get things ready for the next set of yard. They would count me at noon whenever they released all of the other inmates to yard, but I wouldn't be allowed to go out until about 1 p.m. because they had to finish the count. On this day, Scooby was tense. As soon as he came in, I could tell there was something wrong. You have to bear in mind that at this time, at High Desert, whenever I got there, there was an incredible amount of racial tension between the white inmates and the black inmates. They'd been at war for years. People had been trying to kill each other. And just whenever I arrived, peace was declared. Everybody shook hands, said that they wouldn't try and hurt each other anymore. However, it was a tense peace. And there was a period of a couple of weeks where every time I set foot out of my cell, I was spending 5 minutes. I was stretching out. I was making sure I had my head in the right place. My shoes were tied perfectly, that I knew what to do if things kicked off. I didn't know what detail might be the difference between life and death. And I know that sounds extreme, but it was an extreme environment. Scooby coming in all tense and worried. Immediately had me tense and worried. I asked him what's up, and he told me that it was looking like it was going to kick off. That somewhere between 1 and 2 p.m. that day, the whites were going to rush the blacks, and the blacks were going to rush the whites, and it was going to be on and cracking. Took a breath. I got that adrenaline going. I started thinking that I needed to be ready because this was it, and it was going to be bad. You don't have the option of not participating in something like this. If you don't come out and be involved in a riot whenever you could have, they're going to make sure that you suffer for it. They may not kill you, but they just might. At the very least, they are going to beat you severely over it. It occurred to me that I needed to write a letter. I needed to pen something to my wife just in case, because if something happened to me, I needed to have said goodbye to her. I was thinking that I had to find a pen and a paper, and I could leave the letter in a book, and if the cops released my property to her after my death, she'd find it. I wasn't even listening to what Scooby was saying. Hey. And I looked up, and what? And he repeated himself. He said I wasn't going to be out there, that he was going to make it so that I couldn't go out on the yard for the riot. So, Scooby, what do you mean, man? That's not going to work. He explained his plan was that there was an officer that he got along well with, Officer DeWall. DeWall liked me. He was going to go tell DeWall that I'd been drinking, that he shouldn't let me out on the yard today because I was going to get myself in trouble, and he just needed to lock my door and not let me out no matter what I said. I told him, Scooby, this isn't going to work, man. If I've been drinking and I don't go out, that's just as bad. I'm choosing to not go out. Scooby explained he was going to go to the shot caller and tell him that I wanted to go out, but Scooby had made it so I couldn't because he didn't want me involved in any of this. This was a big risk on his part. He'd done a lot of time. He had a lot of respect. I don't think they were going to kill him over something like this, but again, he was certainly going to get a beating. He might end up being expected to commit a crime for the gang to clean it up, is what they called it. He was right, though. If we did this, I wouldn't have to be out in the yard during the riot. I'd be able to say, well, it wasn't my fault, blame Scooby. I didn't know what to do, what to say. In the final analysis, I didn't want to be out there. I didn't want to be hurting anybody because of the color of their skin, and I certainly didn't want to be hurt for the color of mine. He and I talked for a little while. We drank a cup of coffee, made sure we were firing on all cylinders, and then whenever the yard opened up at noon, he left. I was tense. I was pacing back and forth in that little box. I didn't know what to do. If they came by and opened my door and let me go out to yard, I was going to be out there in a riot, but it would make it so Scooby didn't get into trouble. But if I stayed in, it would make it so he did get into trouble. I didn't know what to do. And I'm pacing back and forth, becoming more and more tense, thinking about the possibility that I could be killed that day. I could have to kill somebody to save my own life. That if I wasn't out there, maybe Scooby would be hurt and it would be my fault that I wasn't out there. It was a terrifying chunk of time. And then at 12:55 or so, Scooby came fast walking back in. He came right to the door and went, hey, never mind, call it off. I went, what's going on? What? He explained to me things had been worked out. There was going to be no riot that day. I should still be prepared. I should be alert just in case. But that everybody had worked everything out. He wasn't going to tell DeWall not to crack the door. I would just come out to yard like usual, and we'd pretend like this had never happened. He emphasized that point, don't tell anybody about this. I went out to yard that day, and things were tense. You could tell everybody was watching everybody else. There was a lot of potential violence in the air. But over the course of 3 hours, nothing happened. They recalled the yard. Everybody calmly filed back to their cells. Scooby and I shut the door behind us, and we sat down to play cards and go back to doing the general things that we did most days. But this was an instance where Scooby really put his life on the line for me. And it's easy to write him off. Oh, well, he was that drug addict I had for a cellie, and he was. He was also a decent and generous guy. I wasn't exaggerating whenever I said I considered him an older brother. It's possible that he saved my life, if not on that occasion, on another. And even if he didn't, he was willing to risk himself to save me. The point of all this is it's way too easy to just put somebody into a little box and label it and say that's all they are. Oh, well, Scooby's just that drug addict I lived with, I could say. Or even Officer DeWall, the officer who was going to make it so I didn't have to be out on the yard that day. Oh, well, he's just some officer. But things are never that simple. Your boss isn't just that guy you work for. He leads a complex life. That cop writing you a ticket because you were speeding, he's not just some jerk. He has a reason he's doing what he's doing. If you look for simple answers to complex questions, you're always going to have just half of the story. Scooby wasn't just a drug addict. He was that guy who risked his life, potentially to save mine. So don't write people off, put them into little boxes and pretend you know who they are, because you're more complex than the people around you realize, and I assure you the people around you are more complex than you realize.